You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.
Here is our king who is using foreigners to burn our villages and destroy our property and take away our liberty.
Hello, and welcome to episode 382 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. After the Declaration of Independence's famous statement, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," the Second Continental Congress went on to say, "The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny of these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world." The Congress then laid out 27 grievances, the 25th of which charges that King George III is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun by circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. Friederike Baer, an associate professor of history at Penn State Abbington College, joins us to explore the large armies of foreign mercenaries that King George III hired from German rulers to assist in Great Britain's fight to squash the American Revolution and prevent its 13 North American colonies from leaving the British Empire. Friederike will lead us on this exploration of the German soldiers with details from her book, Hessians, German Soldiers and the American Revolutionary War. Now, during our exploration of the German soldiers, Friederike reveals why we should refer to the nearly 30,000 German soldiers hired by King George III as German soldiers rather than by the contemporary term Hessians. Information about why German rulers agreed to hire out the young men in their principalities as mercenaries to King George III in Great Britain. And details about the contributions the German soldiers made to the British military effort during the American War for Independence, as well as details about how some German soldiers experienced the Revolution and war in North America. But first, today's episode came about because of listener requests for this topic. In fact, there were a lot of listener requests for this topic. When you send me an email requesting a topic, I pay attention. I keep a list. Now, sometimes it can take me a bit of time to work your request into our lineup, but most of our episodes represent your requests. All of this to say, thank you. Thank you for keeping the show active and vibrant with your listener requests. And I listen, which is why it is important that you help this show out by taking our listener survey. Your feedback will help shape this show. To take our listener survey, please visit benfranklinsworld.com/survey. That's benfranklinsworld.com/survey. Thank you so much for your help. All right. Are you ready to explore the German soldiers who fought alongside the British during the American War for Independence? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Our guest is an associate professor of history and the division head for arts and humanities at Penn State Abbington College. Her research expertise is in the American Revolution and early Republic eras, and she has a particular interest in the experiences of German-speaking people during those periods. She's also the author of 2 books, including Hessians, German Soldiers in the American Revolutionary War, which won the 2023 Society of the Cincinnati Prize. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Friederike Baer.
Hi, Liz. I'm so happy to be here.
Friederike, I am so excited to see that your new book, Hessians, is out and ready for us to read because we kind of go back in the history of this book. I think it was 2008. Don't quote me on that. And we were both fellows at the David Library of the American Revolution, which is such a wonderful resource for people who are interested in the American Revolution. And I think you were just in the early stages of researching this very book. So I wonder if you could tell us what brought you to German soldiers and wanting to study their experiences in the American Revolutionary War?
Yeah, I do remember this wonderful research day at the David Library. I started out with a much more narrow research topic. I was interested in the experiences of the wife of a German general. her name is Friederike, who published memoirs about her experiences in the war in North America. I was always fascinated with her narrative, and I thought, there is a lot of research that could be done around her, contextualizing her experiences. She was a member of the Convention Army, those troops that were captured as a result of the British defeat at Saratoga. So I started out with a pretty focused topic, and then as I was getting deeper into it, I realized two things. First of all, there are a lot of records available that were created by members of the German Corps that I don't think had really been explored previously. And then, of course, I also realized there really isn't, or there hasn't been in a long time, a more comprehensive study that really looks at the experiences of these German soldiers between 76 and 83 in North America. So the topic got bigger and bigger, and the result years later was the book that just came out last year.
Now, like many of you, I have heard that there were German soldiers in the American Revolution. You can't read a military history or even a real social history of this period and not hear about the German troops. What I didn't realize till I read Friederike's book, Hessians, is that Great Britain actually hired approximately 30,000 German soldiers to fill and supplement its military ranks during this war. Friederike, could you tell us why Great Britain hired so many foreign soldiers to fight this war and couldn't just rely on Britons to fight this war?
You're absolutely right. I hear this all the time. People have sort of heard of the Hessians or the Germans, but I think people generally don't appreciate the role they played and how many of them went to North America. 30,000 by the early 1780s, 1781, 82, that's about 1/3 of the regular British Army strength. So that's a really significant number of soldiers, not to mention civilians that also accompanied the Corps. Britain had relied on foreign troops for a long time. Since the middle of the 17th century, it had fought all of its foreign wars with the help of foreign auxiliaries. So when Britain decided to turn to German rulers for help, they really didn't do anything unusual. It was accepted practice. Many German, especially larger powers, regularly rented out foreign troops. It was accepted and legal to do so. Britain decided fairly early on, when it became clear that additional military power was required in North America to put down the rebellion, that they would not be able to raise the necessary number of troops within Britain or within other parts of the empire. So they basically resorted to, again, something they had done before, pay money and hire foreign troops that could be used abroad.
Why did Great Britain turn to Germany? Because if you look at European countries with this history of hiring troops out, you can talk about Switzerland and the Swiss Guard and the armies that they hired out. You can look to France. France was doing it as well. There were Britons who were hiring themselves out as mercenaries. There's all sorts of people in the Austrian-Prussian Empire, if you will. So why Germany?
First of all, maybe it's helpful just to remind everyone that Germany as a nation didn't exist. The modern Germany was founded in 1871. At that time, the German territories that we're talking about all belonged to the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was made up of literally hundreds of territories and states and city-states of various sizes. So what the king decided to do is to approach rulers of some of these territories directly to ask them whether they will hire out to him military units. And he approached rulers that had, in some cases, already offered troops to him as early as 1774, possibly, definitely in 1775. Some of these rulers had connections to him. For example, the hereditary Prince of Braunschweig, who's basically ruling Braunschweig at the time, was married to the oldest sister of King George III. So there are dynastic connections as well that kind of help explain why he's reaching out to the rulers that he reached out to. So he's going to these rulers of these territories and asking them, hey, you did this before. Will you once again be willing to support Britain in its effort to put down an unlawful rebellion? I should also mention that he approached other rulers in Germany who declined. So these 6 that ended up hiring out troops were not the only ones that were approached by Britain to do that. Before he went to the German rulers, Britain actually hoped to hire about 20,000 troops from Russia. And Czarina declined for various reasons. Britain also tried to hire or use what is known as the Scots Brigade. That is a Scottish brigade that had been in Dutch service for many decades. The United Province of the Netherlands, after some back and forth, finally agreed, except for they said they can't be used outside of Europe. So that was not particularly helpful. So that's when they started going to the German rulers.
When Friederike and I were fellows at the David Library, it was in Washington Crossing, Pennsylvania, and it was in this farmhouse. We'd research in the library all day, and then we'd join together after our day of research and share meals together. I remember one of the times where we were sharing meals, Friederike, and you were like, we cannot call the German soldiers Hessians. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that and how we should refer to these German soldiers so it's respectful and also helps them identify as they were in the period.
And now my book is called Hessians. Absolutely. So my book is called Hessians because that is a label that has been used since the revolutionary times. The Americans used it to describe all German troops in British service, no matter where exactly they came from. So it is a term that we understand to mean the German soldiers generally. But it is really important to keep in mind that they, in fact, came from 6 different territories. The largest number came from the territories of Hessen-Kassel and Hessen-Hanau, which were separate at the time. So that's why I think that the label Hessian has been used to describe them. But of course, we have also troops from Braunschweig, Waldeck, Anhalt-Zerbst, and Ansbach-Bayreuth. And if you had described a member of any of these corps as a Hessian, I think they would have been offended. It's like, I'm not Hessian, I'm a Braunschweiger. For us, it's a useful term. But in my book, I was very careful to only use the term Hessian when I'm actually talking about Hessians, so to speak. I wanted to be clear that we are talking about soldiers and civilians that are coming, in fact, from many different territories throughout Europe.
So to this point, we've talked about how these German soldiers, they come from 6 different provinces in what we now know as modern Germany. We know that the British need soldiers to come fight the Revolutionary War and to go to North America. Once King George III and his government gets bites from family members and otherwise who say, yes, we will supply troops to you, what is the process of recruiting these troops and getting them to want to go to North America to fight somebody else's war?
That was very challenging. So I mentioned that Britain had hired German troops on many occasions previously, but one big difference is they had never been used outside of Europe. So this is the first time. That's also one reason I think why in Parliament there is significant opposition to what the king is doing, hiring these foreign mercenaries, as critics called them, to fight what is essentially a civil war against fellow British subjects. The German rulers concluded these subsidy treaties basically because they needed money. You can look at the soldiers as a very valuable commodity on the European market. I have men available, you can hire them, you pay me money to do that. It was not challenging for these rulers to fill the officer corps. There were plenty of officers or veterans, also from other German territories, by the way, who requested to be included. They were looking to advance their military careers. So that was not that difficult, but it was challenging to raise the troops. None of these rulers had these units or these regiments ready to go. That's important to keep in mind. It's not that they have, thousands of men and we can just ship them off to America. What they had to do is take existing regiments or men on furlough and garrison units and so forth and use that sort of as a foundation and then fill up the regiments to the required strength. And they did this through, I'm generalizing a little bit, but typically enrollment lists or local officials would have a list of young men who would technically be eligible to serve. They would call them in for inspection and measure their height and see if they're fit for service and then potentially send them off to the collecting depot to be enlisted in the court for America. All of the territories had certain kind of criteria. So you wanted these young men to be of a certain height. You wanted them, of course, be fit for a military campaign in North America. Ideally, they did not have families or dependents that depended on them. Ideally, they were not of particular value to the local economy, so they could be what we call dispensable. Territory would be fine if they're left. All of the territories also had certain criteria that, in theory at least, would make a man ineligible. For example, maybe an only son was about to inherit the family property. College students, apprentices, certain types of professions or occupations were supposed to not be included in these troops because they were needed at home. In practice, that was difficult to implement because there just weren't enough eligible or dispensable men available. So ultimately, men were sent to America that on paper at least should have remained at home. These are militarized territories. I think it is not exactly surprising for families to get the call, your son, or you need to come and report for service. But again, going to America and fighting in a foreign war is definitely something that a lot of these individuals and families were very unhappy about. There was resistance. Some men just didn't show up, or they left the territory when the recruiting parties came around. Parents hid sons in the basement or whatever. So there's a lot of evidence of people not just saying, oh, well, we'll just have to do this because we're ordered to do it. There's resistance to this practice.
I think when we think of the American Revolutionary War from an American perspective, right, we think of it as an all-encompassing war where the Continental Army is short on troops and they will take anyone they can get. And I think we think the same of the British. They send over these troops, and because it's their imperial war as well, they'll send whoever they can get. And what I didn't realize about the German soldiers until I was reading your book, Hessians, is that there was strategy in the recruitment on a level I don't think we can see if we look at the stories of these other armies, where you're laying out the criteria. You're not going to inherit property, your second or third sons. You might just be farmers rather than a blacksmith who could be very key to your community. And it allows them to be more discriminatory.
Yes. Another thing to remember, when this is starting, when they're doing these things, they don't know that the war is going to last as long as it did. So Braunschweig, for example, the Duke on multiple occasions said, no one can be forced to go to America. I only want volunteers. As the war progresses and they need to send reinforcement and replacements, when they're suffering significant losses due to disease and combat, but also captivity, it becomes harder and harder to stick to these principles. So there is no doubt that there were individuals who were in fact impressed, who did go against their will, and again, who would have been more useful, to use that term, at home in their communities with their families.
Now, as we said, Great Britain and Germany are able to recruit a total of around 30,000 soldiers over the course of the war and send them to North America. And it sounds like they are raising German-specific regiments to go and fight with the British Army. Can you tell us about how these German regiments fit within the British Army? Are they regular army and they just kind of put on their red coats?
No. So that's in the treaties that, let's take the example of Waldeck, the smallest territory, rented out maybe a total of 1,200 men over the course of the war. But the original treaty says, we're going to make available for British service one regiment. It becomes known as the 3rd Waldeck Regiment. And that has, I think it was 670 men. And then we have some staff and artillery and all that. But that unit will remain intact with its own officers, its own staff, its own musicians, servants, all of that throughout the entire war. They will fight alongside British, but these individuals are not somehow distributed across regiments or divided up or anything like that, unless, of course, they're captured, which happens to many of them. They very proudly wear their own uniforms. They very proudly identify as members of particular regiments and particular territories. They retain their own chain of command. However, important to keep in mind, the overall commander, no matter where they are, on campaign or in garrison, whatever, would always be a British officer. So we have only one or two moments, essentially, in the war where a German officer will be in charge. So German officers always have to report, essentially, to a British commander. But other than that, the units are intact, serve alongside British and also, of course, provincial and other kind of more irregular forces.
When these units are ready, we're talking a lot about everyday people we could identify coming from farms and everyday lives. And now they're in a new place, North America. And when we look at history, people from Europe have different ideas about what North America is like and how they're experiencing it initially. During your research, did you come across any accounts of what these soldiers are thinking about their arrival in North America and what kind of place they've arrived in?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I think many, if not most of these people know very little about North America. You have basically no understanding what the imperial struggle or the war is about. But even the land and the people, the landscape, the continent, you would be surprised how little accurate information is available by the mid-1770s in German-speaking Europe. Of course, tens of thousands of Germans had immigrated to North America. They had, for the most part, not come from the territories that are sending troops abroad. So that's one reason why information is probably limited. But it also just didn't necessarily reach rural regions where many of these soldiers are coming from. So they're coming to North America and they are writing about what they see, experience, encounter in their letters, in diaries, in sometimes just private records, in many cases, material that was sent back to Europe to be published or shared amongst acquaintances. It's a huge body of information. I didn't really expect that when I started my research. These people were definitely curious. And the fact that they're describing America in such great detail, and by America I mean the British colonies and Canada also, I think serves as evidence that a lot of what they saw was new to them and was important enough to record in writing. One note about sources, a lot of these records are penned by officers and civilian members of the Corps, for example, chaplains, surgeons, those kind of individuals. We have relatively few written records from the rank and file, so to speak. So it's always something to keep in mind. Officers are more likely to be educated, more likely to be literate, more likely to have a desire and the time to record their experiences. So we have huge amount of information, and the initial impressions, I should say, are very, very positive. The first German troops land in Canada. And then that same summer, 76, a couple of the major divisions of Hessians and also Waldeckers land in New York. And they are very impressed with what they find. The landscape, the farms, they're impressed with what they describe as very high standard of living. In their minds, even the humble white American lives in a nicer house than a wealthy man in Hessian. So they're really, really impressed with what they see there. They are going to be less impressed with regions like Georgia or West Florida, mainly because of the climate. But the initial impressions are very favorable.
On the reverse of that, how did the Americans feel that the king has hired out soldiers to come fight them rather than sending more fellow Britons to come fight them?
Even before the first Germans arrive in North America, the American patriots, as we call them, used Britain's decision to send foreign quote-unquote mercenaries to North America as a tool to rile up the people, to encourage calls for resistance, and ultimately, once they arrive, motivate men to take up arms. It becomes a very useful argument, again, for resistance against British tyranny. Here is our king who is using foreigners to burn our villages and destroy our property and take away our liberty. This is already happening in the spring of 76, which of course then in July we have the Declaration of Independence, and it is one of the lines in the Declaration of Independence. He is now sending foreign mercenaries. Doesn't mention the Germans by name, but it's obviously one of the grievances. So it is used in that way. And it will be used in that way throughout the first campaign in the fall of 76. When you're researching these American descriptions of British and Hessian, particularly atrocities against the civilian population or against a vanquished enemy, those kind of things, it's very difficult to know for sure what is true, what is exaggerated, what is fantasy, because they are using this to motivate people to fight against these invaders. So that's all through 76. At the same time, and that's an interesting sort of flip side, the Congress in particular is also very interested in enticing German soldiers to desert. So within days of German soldiers' arrival in New York, the first broadsides are circulated with congressional offers of land and liberty to any Hessian soldier who puts down arms and basically leaves the forces and settles somewhere in North America. So there is two sides. On the one hand, the Hessian is sort of a monster, ruthless, brutal mercenaries, and we have to defend ourselves and our women and children from this invader. But at the same time, he's also a victim of a tyrannical ruler who's selling him for money to a foreign king who is a tyrant. Shouldn't we welcome these poor people into our communities? So it is an interesting sort of two ways of looking at the reception.
I'm glad you raised that because I have seen some of these propaganda measures, and they are both on the side of let's inflame the American people so we can hopefully spur more support for the war and more men to join the army. And also, hey, you're being mistreated. Come settle in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and the breadbasket of America, and you could have a farm too. Like, you can't have that in Germany. So I was going to ask you to go in that a little bit more, because I imagine if you're a German in this situation, some of this must have felt a little confusing, and you've entered this volatile situation, and I can't imagine what they must have done in that situation.
It's true. So these German soldiers come to North America and again, very impressed with what they see, don't really understand what the war is about, certainly wonder why a people that is doing so well would rise up against their king. Like, what is their problem? The king has obviously treated them very well. What are they complaining about? This talk of liberty, it seems very abstract when you see how these people are actually living. So there is some suspicion. I think that's important to keep in mind. There's some suspicion about what this rebellion is really about. There are some German officers who speculate that it's really a handful of American men in Congress or in high positions in the army that are doing this for selfish reasons, who are essentially manipulating the people to rise up against an indulgent king. So that's important to keep in mind. In other words, for the Germans, even though it looks great in America, they're not entirely sure what it would be like to live there. So you're a young man, you're recruited into a Hessian regiment, you come here, you're wearing your uniform, you are loyal to your ruler, you have loyalty to the officers, to the fellow men in your unit, and you know too that desertion can carry a significant punishment. So it would be very challenging, I think, for many people to actually take that serious step. You also don't know how you would be treated in North America. Would you really be welcomed into the communities and have a farm and all of that? That's not a given at all to these people. So these appeals to desert from the Congress, I think, are not as successful as Congress was hoping. Ultimately, we know, of course, that over the course of the war, a good number of German soldiers deserted, but many of them basically had been prisoners of war for extended periods of time. They had lived and worked in communities and at some point decided, I basically want to stay here.
So how did the German soldiers adjust to this different climate, a place that's speaking English all the time instead of German, and this style of warfare that isn't just these linear tactics that most formal European armies adopted, but we're hiding behind trees and we're fighting using the environment? I've heard it described by military historians as a more guerrilla type of warfare. So how are these German soldiers experiencing the war in this new place?
Yes, they realized pretty quickly that they had to make significant adjustments. One good example is the experience of the troops in Canada, partly because of the terrain and the climate. But when they get there in the late summer of 76, Quebec really, that's where most of them will end up. They realize pretty quickly that they're not going to be able to fight in this sort of traditional 18th century European style, which is very regular with an order of bataille and very linear and all of that kind of stuff. And they're being trained right away, for example, to maintain order, but at the same time are able to make independent decisions, to take advantage of the natural landscape, to hide behind rocks or trees or whatever in this quote unquote wilderness. They also learn how to row boats, which was new to many of these soldiers. Quebec, not just the St. Lawrence River with its rapids, but there's many waterways that they had to constantly travel down or traverse. So learning to row these bateaux, as they were called, was something that all the soldiers had to do. So they have to get used to the weather. They have to get used to gear. So that's part of the adjustment. But yeah, they also have to adjust to fighting against an enemy who is engaged in this sort of irregular or guerrilla kind of warfare. You don't know when you're sending a patrol through the woods whether you might encounter the enemy at some point. These German soldiers also often struggle to distinguish friend from foe. That's something in a kind of civil war-like conditions that is always very challenging. But how do they know when they encounter someone whether that person is a rebel or a loyalist? And then finally, the language barrier is a major issue. Very few Germans know English at the time. It's not taught at the military academies. So there are a handful of German soldiers that had fought in Britain or had been in British service before, probably picked up some English. Handful of forward-looking soldiers who teach themselves, or with the help of maybe the sailors and crew on the vessels on the transatlantic voyage, try to pick it up as quickly as possible. But we see complaints about an inability, not just to understand the Americans, but to understand British soldiers and commanding officers. We see complaints about that throughout the entire war. That's very frustrating for many of the men.
I'm also thinking about the language barrier and the culture barrier that you're talking about in terms of a very diverse population in North America. Yes, we know that there are Europeans, but in similar auxiliary units, you have different Native American peoples. We have formerly enslaved African Americans who are fleeing to British lines due to promises of freedom. Do we know how the German soldiers reacted to working with Native Americans and African Americans that are coming into the lines? Because that must have seemed very different to them.
Oh, absolutely. I think those two are populations or topics that get a lot of attentions in some of these diaries and letters. About Native Americans, the soldiers in Canada and the soldiers that were in West Florida pay most attention to them. And it's not surprising because that's where Native Americans really were in greater numbers than in other parts in the British colonies. And that's where German soldiers fought alongside Native American allies and also against Native American enemies. Generally speaking, in the descriptions of Native Americans, it's ambivalent. Again, on the one hand, especially in Canada, they're described as sort of a simpler, purer, more virtuous people, untouched by quote unquote civilization. And some of the Germans really admire that. They really feel like this is nature. It's like a Rousseauan view. This is nature in its infancy, one soldier writes. And he is very admiring. But there's the flip side too. And that is because they are quote unquote seen as simpler, they're also often described as more animal-like and therefore more violent, more unpredictable. And the experience with scalping, that gets a lot of attention in German records. And Germans are just absolutely shocked by the practice of scalping and the violence that in their minds is perpetuated by Native Americans against other people, including potentially allies. In other words, they're often very fearful of Native Americans because they don't really know whether they can be trusted. When it comes to enslaved people or slavery in general, anyone who wrote about it is absolutely critical of the institution of slavery. And that is an example where they are confused too. American people are fighting for liberty, and yet they are enslaving others to do the work for them. There's a chaplain, his name is Becker, with the Hessian Corps, who writes in a letter back home to Kassel in Germany. He writes literally, if there was a people in North America who should be fighting for their freedom, it would be Black people. So there is that tension. They describe Black people as being exploited, treated very badly by white people, and they feel pity, I think, for them. Over the course of the war, hundreds of Black men, women, and children would attach themselves to German military units. Their presence in German encampments was a common sight. Black men are actively recruited as musicians, particularly drummers, but they're also servants and generally helping in different roles around the camp. We have a couple of instances of Black men serving as privates, but that's unusual. We have Black children that end up in camps, in some cases are sent to Germany during the war as quote-unquote gifts to members of the court, for example. And we know for a fact, there are probably more, that at least 200 Black men, women, and children went with the German Corps to Germany in 1783 and settled there.
When most people think of the German soldiers and their participation in the American Revolution, they remember these key moments. The battles of Trenton and Princeton in 76 and 77, the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. These are moments of German defeat. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the Battle of Trenton and the German involvement there and what role the Germans were able to play in this war, and are they always defeated?
No, they're not. You're absolutely right. Most famous, Trenton, Saratoga, Yorktown. That's where they show up most often in historical studies as well to this day. And yes, these are very important battles, and they're also all major American victories for various reasons. And they included large numbers of Germans. But we have to think about the Battle of Rhode Island, Brandywine, Red Bank, Monmouth, Charleston, Savannah, Guilford Courthouse, Pensacola, to name only a few. All of these involved large numbers of German soldiers, and some of them were significant British victories. Trenton is important, and there's no denying it. I think it's much more important to the Americans than it is to the British or the Germans, because it does come at Christmas 1776 at a very crucial time in the war. I think, as many of your listeners probably know, the campaign had not gone very well for the Americans in the fall of 76. The terms of enlistments were supposed to be up for many of the men under Washington at the end of the year. Morale is very low. So this daring crossing of the ice-covered Delaware and then the attack on a garrison, basically 3 German regiments in winter quarters in the town of Trenton in New Jersey, that was a major feat. So as a surprise attack, there had been rumors in the German camp that the Americans were planning something, but the commander, by all accounts, didn't take that seriously. And then I think there was general agreement that Washington wouldn't dare cross the river in the middle of winter. But of course he did. At the time, there were maybe 1,400 German troops stationed there. There were other German troops in other posts like Bordentown, for example, and different garrisons in New Jersey. Washington attacked, or his troops attacked. Battle didn't last that long. It was snowing. Approximately 1,000 of these troops ended up as American prisoners of war. So it's a victory under George Washington, which is important. Again, at a time when morale was low. It's humiliating for the British. It's definitely embarrassing for the Germans. But I think from a German perspective, it wasn't quite as devastating as Americans would like to think. First of all, capturing 1,000 Hessians is bad, but the number of losses is very small. I think it's fewer than 20. So that's one thing. But the Germans also are able to construct a narrative that preserves their honor, so to speak. The commander of the Hessians, his name is Johann Rall. He was mortally wounded and died. And an investigation that took place a few years later that looked into the conduct of the German troops at Trenton essentially pinned the blame on Rall. The surviving officers basically agreed that he was to blame for this unfortunate affair, as they called it. It's easy to do when the guy is dead, couldn't defend himself. There was no doubt that the soldiers themselves had acted honorably. Again, Christmas, surprise attack, snowstorm, cannon didn't function right. In other words, they were tricked almost by the Americans that resulted into the defeat. So journals at the time and sort of the narrative becomes like, yeah, they're lost, but it's not their fault. There's a number of circumstances that explain that.
After the siege of Yorktown in 1781, big military fighting ends in what is mainly in North America. It's not all fighting ended. There was plenty of skirmishes between loyalists and revolutionaries, but formal fighting has ended. What happened to the German troops? We often talk about the age of revolutions and how the American Revolution inspired the Haitian Revolution and the French Revolution because of experiences and knowledge of what happened in North America. Did participating in the revolution incite anything similar in Germany when these soldiers went home? Did they go home?
First of all, as you suggested, but I do want to emphasize this, that yes, Yorktown, we know now, basically ends the war, but it didn't really end the war at the time. So there were shipments of several thousand German recruits that were sent to North America after Yorktown. And it's important to keep that in mind. It's not that suddenly the war's over and we no longer need these troops. Britain was preparing for additional campaigns. And the German rulers, by the way, when word finally reaches them that a peace treaty had been concluded or is in the works, were very disappointed that the men that had been recruited for 1783 would no longer be needed. When Yorktown happened, also, there are thousands of troops in New York and Canada, and also still occupying Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. They remain there into 1782. So again, just as a reminder that for these people, the war is not over. They are doing pretty much what they had been doing before Yorktown. They continue to do that. When the war is finally over, basically thousands of soldiers remained prisoners of war. They're basically released and instructed to go back mostly to New York, in some cases to Canada, if they're Braunschweigers, in preparation for embarkment to go back to Europe. And most of them do that, but some don't. Some will, especially if they've been in captivity for a while, maybe lived and worked in local communities, maybe married an American woman. Some of them will decide to stay behind and they just don't report back. And there's no indication that officers at that point tried very hard to retrieve them, so to speak. In some cases, rulers welcomed that certain individuals stayed behind. Men who would, in their minds, be essentially burdens or costly to maintain at home because maybe they had been injured or maybe they had been poor to begin with or maybe they had committed some sort of crime. These people were all encouraged to stay back home. In some cases, they were literally denied passage back to Europe. Most territories did not allow individuals to just stay behind without permission. So some people, again, did it anyway. Others requested permission. In some cases, permission was denied. If you were valuable to the military or your local community, you were basically requested to please report back home. Some soldiers took advantage of British offers for land grants in Canada, and they settled there, especially in Quebec, but also in Nova Scotia and other provinces up there. I did not see any evidence that the experiences of the German soldiers motivated or planted any ideas for any kind of rebellion or revolution or uprising or resistance, if that's what you mean. I think they remained skeptical what was really happening in America. I think these people, they were products of systems with a ruler. They're loyal to that ruler. Rebellion against that kind of system to them was just not an option. I don't think they could conceive of it. And I would also say that rebellion in the minds of many people back then was equated with disorder. And liberty is not necessarily a good thing. Too much freedom can lead to a lack of morals. You get German soldiers to write about it in those terms as well. So I don't think it really planted any ideas in people's head. Only thing that I would mention is that I think Britain's hiring of German auxiliaries in the war is sort of the beginning of the end of what some people have called the soldier trade, because it does raise questions about using foreign soldiers against your own subjects, and in this case on another continent. German soldiers would be hired out until the 18 teens, so it doesn't end overnight. But it did raise significant opposition, enough opposition to really make people wonder, is this really sustainable? Is this practice compatible with the Enlightenment and the rise of the nation states?
Before we move into the time warp, I have one more legacy question, if you will, about the German soldiers in the American Revolution. So we know that Great Britain hired these German soldiers because they really thought they would help the British Army bring a quick end to this rebellion, that they thought that the German soldiers would help suppress it. In the end, now that you've looked at all these different German experiences, you've looked at some of the battles and the campaigns, you found that they've participated in nearly every aspect of British military campaign. What do you think the actual military impact of the German auxiliary forces was in the American War for Independence?
Aside from helping determine the outcome of individual battles or military encounters, I think that helped prolong the war. Again, Britain's ability to draw on this resource, this manpower, with the equipment, by the way, I think really helped them to keep fighting for longer than they would have been able to do, assuming that they would not have at some point resorted to raising more men at home. But I don't think they would have been able to do that. So that's one consequence. The other thing to consider, and I mentioned this earlier, is that Britain's use of these foreigners did provide the American rebels or patriots with ammunition, essentially, with another tool in their arguments for a complete break with the king. Because at some point in 76, they start literally saying, like, the king is not treating us like his subjects anymore. He is breaking up with us, basically, by engaging as foreigners. So that was, I think, another important contribution in a sense. And the final thing I just want to mention in terms of legacy or what this means, these soldiers were really an incredible source of information for German-speaking Europeans at the time. And they remain an incredible source of information about the American war and the land of the people for us today. The volume of material is incredible that they have created. Official records, of course, but also private records. And I want to use this opportunity to make a little bit of a plug for thinking about these military records broadly. Much of the material includes descriptions about American customs, about American manners, about the landscape, about the war, about the army, the officers, strategy, everything. So we have to define military history very broadly to really appreciate their contributions.
And now we should move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Friederike, in your opinion, how might the American War for Independence have turned out differently if German soldiers had not arrived with the first wave of British soldiers? Do you think there would have still been a long war if the German soldiers hadn't showed up to help the British from the beginning?
No, I think the war would not have lasted as long as it did. I think it did give the British a real chance to actually put down the rebellion. And I think once you go into different regions within North America, you could probably also make the argument that they might have lost certain territories that they ended up keeping. For example, Canada or Quebec. As I mentioned, several thousand soldiers were sent to Quebec. We think of these soldiers mostly because some of them accompanied John Burgoyne down to Saratoga and were captured. But thousands remained in Canada throughout the entire war, so that by the early 80s, there are more German soldiers there than British soldiers. And they, of course, help preserve that province, essentially. Most of them never see combat. They are there to defend this province from the Americans. So it's possible that without the presence of all these German soldiers there, who knows what would have happened to Quebec and possibly also Nova Scotia. Maybe the Americans would have dared another invasion, and maybe that one would have succeeded.
It's interesting to think about, but I think even if that had happened, I'm not sure the Canadians would have been willing to join based on the records I've seen about how American soldiers were treating them.
Yes, that's true too.
So Friederike, you study a lot of life for German-speaking people here in early North America, whether it's the Revolutionary War or the early Republic period. What kind of project are you working on now?
Yeah, I'm basically returning to Frederike Baer. She remains very fascinating. I think her book, some people know about it, but it's never been the subject of a full-length study. It's been published, but no one has really read it closely and contextualized it. And because she is a member of the Convention Army, the book is, I would say, it's focusing on her, but it is about the Convention Army, the German portion of the Convention Army, the troops that were captured at Saratoga. I was just reading a letter yesterday by a clerk with one of the regiments who is a member of the Convention Army that for a while they were in and around Boston. He is lodging in Cambridge, and he writes in this letter to his parents back in Germany. He's like, I'm having a great time. I'm taking classes at Harvard College. I'm going to the local taverns, and I'm writing letters. It's wonderful. It's so hard for us to imagine. This is a prisoner of war. So tons of records like this, I think, really will give us a really unique and fuller view of what it was like in North America as a prisoner of war. So that's what I'm working on right now.
When I met Friederike at the David Library, I was researching my dissertation about Albany, New York, and you did turn me on to Baroness von Riedhesel, and I read her narrative, and she has some nice things to say about the Schuylers.
Yes.
Philip Schuyler had John Burgoyne and his retinue over, and it included Baroness von Riedhesel. So she did offer insight into what that home was like and what kind of dinner they served and how they treated the British and the German POWs. And so just to prove Friederike's point, there is a lot of really great information in these German sources.
Yes, absolutely.
So we just scratched the surface today. We really gave an overview of the depth of information in your book, Hessians. If we read that book and we have more questions, how can we get in contact with you to ask them?
I love hearing from people. Please reach out. I do maintain a website, which is my name, frederikebaer.com. where I also share these sort of random sources that I came across that have not been published. I transcribe them, I translate them, I contextualize them. So I encourage everyone to take a look. Also, you can contact me through the website, or you can easily find me at the Penn State University website as well.
Friederike, thank you so much for joining us and bringing us into the world of the German soldiers in the American Revolution and their experiences.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really, really wonderful seeing you again and having this conversation. Thank you.
German rulers from 6 principalities agreed to send King George III 30,000 soldiers to assist in a civil war that raged between his people. From Friederike, we learned about these soldiers' experiences during the American War for Independence. The soldiers who served in the German Corps were often officers looking to extend and build up their military careers and service, as well as everyday young men who German rulers actually saw as dispensable. These experiences in North America were both collective and individual. An inability to speak English or speak English well often proved a barrier to the soldiers fitting in with their British counterparts. The language barrier also made them unsure about the American people. Without knowledge of English, the German soldiers could observe American customs, economic station, and the landscapes that Americans lived and farmed on. They could observe indigenous peoples and enslaved African and African Americans. They could also discern that slavery was wrong and made the notion of Americans' fight and calls for liberty complicated and contradictory. The language barrier, along with their experiences living under German rulers, often made it difficult for German soldiers to truly understand the American Revolution and what Americans believed they were fighting for. Americans called their king a despot and tyrant, but all the Germans saw was how well off Americans seemed to be given their ability to conduct trade and practice their skilled crafts and farm on what seemed to be great land. The Germans also seemed to understand that they were soldiers caught in the middle. On the one hand, they were despised by Americans for being foreign mercenaries, and on the other hand, they were courted by Americans who wanted them to leave their families, friends, and homes by abandoning their arms, deserting their regiments, and taking up a plow on a new American homestead. With such conflicting messages and treatment, how were the Germans to know who to trust? What we can trust is Friederike's assessment that the contributions of the German soldiers and their equipment made it possible for Great Britain to participate in its civil war for far longer than would have been possible if the empire had simply relied on British soldiers and British goods. However, it is also true that the more service the German soldiers saw in North America, the more opportunities they had to create the great trove of information about the American Revolution, its war for independence, and life in early North America. It's a trove of information that many of us will have to learn German to read, but it exists as another body of primary sources that historians can use to learn more about the Revolutionary era and uncover new truths about it. You'll find more information about Friederike, her book, Hessians, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/382. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. And please take our listener survey at benfranklinsworld.com/survey. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios, Katie Schinnebeck, Ashley Bachknight, Jordan Hammond, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, are there other details about the German soldiers and their experiences in Revolutionary America that you would like to hear covered on the show? Let me know. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.